good afternoon, and welcome to Election Bites, bite-sized conversations for your lunch hour. This week, we are very glad to be joined by Kevin Johnson, and we are going to be talking about what we as Americans expect from our candidates, both during the campaign, but also in the post-election period. And we'll have a specific and very special focus on the candidate principles for trusted elections. Kevin Johnson is the executive director of the Election Reformers Network and has been a member of the Carter Center's U.S. elections team since 2020. Welcome, Kevin.
Thank you, Avery. Nice to be here and sharing a lunch bite with Carter Center friends.
We're glad to have you back. Can you tell us what are the candidate principles for trusted elections?
Sure. The candidate principles, it's really a program designed to reassure Americans, that the core ideals of our country are still sound and still held in esteem by our political leaders. It's led by a coalition of 60 plus organizations on the right, on the left, and the center, with the Carter Center and the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation as the two co-heads. And that coalition has come together and distilled, in a sense, kind of the core essence of what we need candidates to do when they're running for office and what the core principles are. And I can quickly summarize those. These are also up on the website, and I'm sure Avery will direct you to those. So the 5 principles are: first, honest process, meaning adhering to election rules, cooperating with election officials, and not knowingly propagating any falsehoods about the election. The second is civil campaign, meaning encouraging a peaceful atmosphere through the campaign and the election process and denouncing violence. The third is secure voting, by which we mean respecting the right of all lawful voters to participate freely without intimidation. The fourth is a kind of a detail, but it's responsible oversight. And here we're talking about the commitment of candidates to make sure their poll watchers, their representatives in the polling stations, are well trained and know the rules and respect the guidelines of how they should operate in their important role of lending transparency to elections. And the last and sort of the ultimate, or the keystone of the 5 in a way, is trusted outcomes. And that means that every candidate should make any claims about election irregularities in accordance with the law, and they should acknowledge the legitimacy of the outcomes after the results have been certified and all contestations decided.
Thanks, Kevin. So that's really helpful to sort of have the overview of what the 5 principles are. As you were sort of describing them, I was wondering, could you tell us a little bit more about sort of where the idea for the principles came from and maybe how that work has developed over the course of the last few months?
Sure. So the Carter Center has used the same kind of concept and work overseas for many years, often under the rubric of a code of conduct, and often with the idea of getting competing parties to agree on what some basic rules of conduct should be. That's been very effective overseas. The Carter Center introduced that same idea for the runoff, the Georgia Senate runoff in December 2020, quite successfully. And following on that, we began to grow this program as a pilot for 2022, looking ahead to 2024. And in recent months, we've seen a lot of growth in our coalition and growth in interest. And it's developing a lot of momentum. And as I said at the outset, it's really reassuring that there are so many people. We're over 500 who've signed this program so far that commit to these principles. I think that is reassuring, because there's so much in the news these days about our democracy being under threat. But this is a good indication that their core principles are still adhered to.
I think there are other pledges out there that sort of maybe ask candidates to, support democratic ideals. Could you tell us a little bit about how this is maybe different from some of those other efforts? And, who are some of the 500 folks that you just mentioned that are maybe particularly noteworthy who support the principles?
Sure. So yes, the candidates often get asked to sign in advance, to commit to things in advance. Sometimes that's on the policy side. They can be asked by organizations, on the more conservative side, that they will pledge not to raise taxes, or maybe on the more liberal side that they will pledge not to, cut spending or something. So There are partisan versions of this, and there are now starting to be a few of the same kinds of things that we're doing here, which is great. The notion of organizations operating from a bipartisan and neutral perspective and just getting candidates on board with core ideas that support democracy is terrific, and a number of organizations doing that is all to the best. And to your point of some of the noteworthy names there in Georgia, there are a couple that are really important. So the leading candidates for governor are both committed to the candidate principles. Governor Kemp and the Democratic challenger Stacey Abrams are both on board. Likewise, for the critical office of Secretary of State, we have the Secretary of State pairs in Georgia, candidate pairs in Georgia, and a couple of other states that have also signed on. And then we have just a real range of candidates in many states. In some cases, locally very important roles. The hotly contested office of the Land Commissioner of New Mexico, very important in that state, with a strong Democrat and Republican candidates who are both on board, just as an example of the diversity of folks who have joined on to this.
That's great to hear that there's sort of a wide array of supporters and that we have supporters all across the country. Could you tell us a little bit more about how candidates are maybe held accountable to the principles when they sign on, or what does their support mean?
Yeah, it's a good question. And a core concept behind the program the Carter Center has run is we want a broad coalition that supports this, and we don't want that coalition to have to play policeman. So we have not asked the members of our coalition to make decisions about whether a certain act might violate one of the principles. Instead, we really call on the media and the voters to be the source of accountability. That said, I expect particularly that last principle about upholding results and making sure there's trust in results. We'll see how things play out after the election. But it may be that the Carter Center will want to, call for just the recognition that results that have been fully verified, fully tested in courts, need to be respected by all folks who have pledged to these principles. So those are different ways that there'll be accountability around this.
Great. So my last question for you, Kevin, for this bite: how can Election Bite viewers support the principles themselves?
Well, go to the website, which is principledcandidates.org. And any citizen can also sign their support to the principles. And you also can get in touch with your candidates, people running for office at different levels in your area, and tell them this is something you believe in and you want to see them standing up for. So those are a couple direct actions that can really help.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Kevin, to talk about the candidate principles. Thank you to our viewers for joining us. Join us again next week. We're looking forward to having another Election Bite conversation with you then. Be well. Thank you.
Thank you, Avery. Always a pleasure.